Welcome back to Nighttime History. Today we will be travelling to the winter of 185 to the left bank of Paris, where we will spend an evening with a young scholar preparing for his examinations at the University of Paris. Make sure to like this video to support our channel. Let us know in the comments where you are settling into sleep tonight, what time it is, and where in the world you are listening from. The bells of Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre had just rung for Compline when Thomas de Caumont pushed open the heavy oak door of his lodging house on the Rue du Forêt. The Street of Straw, they called it, named for the bundles of hay students sat upon during lectures in the unheated halls nearby. His breath formed clouds in the frigid January air as he climbed the narrow stairs to his chamber on the third floor, his leather satchel heavy with borrowed manuscripts that must be returned to the stationer by week's end. The room was hardly larger than a monk's cell. A single window, its shutters already latched tight against the cold, faced east toward the Seine. Thomas could hear the river if he listened carefully, a constant whisper beneath the sounds of the city. He set his satchel on the floor beside his writing desk, a simple table of beechwood that wobbled slightly on the uneven planks. His landlady, the widow Marguerite, had already been by. A fresh candle stood in the brass holder, and she had left a small bundle of kindling beside the brazier in the corner. Thomas knelt before the brazier and began the familiar ritual of building a fire. The charcoal was expensive, nearly 3 deniers for a week's supply, but the university required its scholars to maintain certain standards. One could not produce quality work with fingers too numb to hold a quill. He arranged the kindling carefully, then struck his flint against steel until a spark caught in the dried moss. The flame grew slowly, reluctantly, as though it too felt the weight of winter. While the brazier heated, Thomas lit his candle from the small flame. The beeswax was pure and pale, another expense he could ill afford, but tallow produced too much smoke for the close work ahead. The candlelight pushed back the darkness in a small circle, illuminating his desk and leaving the corners of the room in shadow. He had grown accustomed to this particular quality of light over the past 3 years, the way it turned the pages of his books golden, the way it made the red and blue illumination seem to glow from within. From his satchel, he withdrew the day's acquisitions. First, a commentary on Aristotle's Physics by Albertus Magnus, copied in a clear university hand. The parchment was good quality, smooth beneath his fingertips. He had paid the stationer 2 sous to borrow it for 5 days, and he intended to extract every useful argument from its margins before the loan expired. Second, his own notebook, a gathering of 16 leaves that he had purchased unbound and stitched himself to save money. The pages were covered in his cramped notation, a mixture of Latin and the abbreviated symbols that allowed scholars to write quickly during lectures. Thomas settled onto his stool, adjusting his position until the light fell properly across his desk. Outside, he could hear the city preparing for night. Shutters banged closed. A merchant called out a final time, advertising meat pies, his voice growing distant. Someone laughed in the street below, probably students from the English nation, making their way to one of the taverns that stayed open despite the Chancellor's prohibitions. Thomas felt a brief pang of longing for such carelessness, then dismissed it. He had examinations in less than a month. Master Giles of Rome himself would be questioning him on natural philosophy, and the master was known for his exactitude. He opened the commentary to the passage he had marked that afternoon during the lecture at the Sorbonne. Albertus addressed the question of motion, whether it existed in the object moved or in the mover. Thomas dipped his quill in the iron gall ink, testing it on a scrap of parchment to ensure the flow was correct. The ink was thick tonight, cold from sitting in his room all day. He held the bottle near the candle flame for a moment to warm it, careful not to let it get too hot, which would make it spread and feather on the page. His hand moved across the parchment in the practiced script of the university. First, he wrote the proposition in Albertus's own words, then beneath it his own analysis. The quill scratched softly, a sound he had come to love, the physical manifestation of thought becoming permanent. He worked slowly, pausing frequently to consider his phrasing. In the cathedral schools of his youth, he had been taught to write quickly, to copy without reflection. But at Paris, among the masters of theology and philosophy, he had learned that writing was itself a form of thinking, that the act of putting words to parchment forced clarity upon confused ideas. The candle burned steadily. Thomas had learnt to judge time by the consumption of wax. This candle would last perhaps 4 hours if he kept the wick properly trimmed. He had developed the habit of checking it every quarter hour or so, pinching away the blackened end to keep the flame clean and bright. It was one of many small disciplines he had acquired since coming to Paris, the accumulated wisdom of thousands of scholars who had sat in rooms like this one, pursuing learning by candlelight. He turned to a fresh page in his notebook and began to construct a syllogism. If motion exists in the object moved, and if the object moved is distinct from the mover, then motion must be a quality that can be transferred from one substance to another. But qualities, according to Aristotle, inhere in substances and cannot migrate. Therefore, either motion is not a quality, or it does not exist solely in the object moved. He wrote out each premise carefully, checking his logic at each step. Master Giles would certainly probe for weaknesses in reasoning, for unstated assumptions. Outside, the city grew quieter. The last of the merchants had gone home. The taverns were full now, and the streets belonged to the night watch and to those who had reason to avoid them. Thomas heard the watch go by once, their footsteps and low voices passing beneath his window. He did not look up from his work. Paris after dark was not his concern tonight. His world had contracted to the circle of candlelight, to the page before him, to the careful construction of arguments that might, if he was fortunate, earn him the right to continue his studies. He reached for the second book in his satchel, a collection of questions on the physics, compiled by a master whose name was not recorded. The manuscript was older, the parchment darker and more brittle. Someone had spilled wine on one corner, leaving a pale brown stain that obscured several words. Thomas held the page close to the candle, squinting at the damaged text. He could make out most of it through context. The question concerned the nature of time, whether it existed independently of the soul that perceived it. This was the sort of question that could occupy a scholar for years. Thomas had heard of masters who had devoted entire careers to single questions from Aristotle, writing commentary upon commentary, disputing with their colleagues in the public determinations, refining their positions over decades. He found the thought both inspiring and daunting. To know one thing so thoroughly, to pursue a single question to its depths, required a kind of courage he was not certain he possessed. He made notes in the margin of his notebook, using the special abbreviations that saved space and time. A small curved line for autumn, a crossed P for per, the symbol that looked like a figure 7 for etc. His first master had taught him these marks, explaining that a scholar who could not write quickly was at a disadvantage in disputations, where arguments flew fast and must be recorded for later analysis. Thomas had spent months practicing the abbreviations until they became second nature, until his hand formed them without conscious thought. The brazier had warmed the room enough that he could remove his outer cloak. He stood and draped it over the end of his bed, a narrow frame with a straw mattress that Marguerite replaced twice a year. His blanket was good wool, sent from home by his mother, who worried constantly that he was not eating or sleeping enough. She was not entirely wrong. Thomas often worked through the night when examinations approached, sustained by bread and weak wine, sleeping only when exhaustion forced him to his bed. But tonight he felt alert, focused. The cold air from the window kept his mind sharp. He returned to his desk and opened his notebook to a section he had begun the previous week, a series of distinctions on the nature of substantial form. This was the heart of the matter, the question that underlay so much of natural philosophy. What made a thing what it was? What was the relationship between matter and form, between the potential and the actual? Thomas wrote steadily, building his argument piece by piece. He cited Aristotle, then the Arabic commentator Averroes, then Albertus, showing how each had understood the problem. He noted where they agreed and where they diverged. He added his own tentative proposals, phrasing them carefully as questions rather than assertions. A student did not contradict the masters directly, not if he hoped to earn his degree. The candle had burned down perhaps a quarter of its length when Thomas realized his hand was cramping. He set down the quill and flexed his fingers, working out the stiffness. The ink on the page was already dry, black and permanent against the pale parchment. He read over what he had written, checking for errors in logic or Latin. It was good work, he thought, though Master Giles would undoubtedly find points to challenge. That was the purpose of the examination, to test not just knowledge but the ability to defend one's positions under questioning. He stood and walked to the window, unlatching the shutter slightly to let in fresh air. The cold rushed in immediately, sharp and clean. Below, the Rue de Fouars was empty and dark. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The river whispered its constant song. Above the rooftops across the street, he could see stars, hard and bright in the winter sky. He had learned their names from a master who taught astronomy, learned the great wheel of the heavens and how the celestial spheres turned in their perfect circles. That same master had warned his students against spending too much time in speculation about the stars, lest they neglect the more important study of sacred scripture. Thomas closed the shutter and returned to his desk. The room had cooled quickly, and he was glad for the warmth of the brazier. He added a few more pieces of charcoal, watching them catch and glow. The smell of the smoke was familiar and oddly comforting, mixed with the beeswax of the candle and the mustiness of old parchment. These were the smells of scholarship, of the life he had chosen when he left his father's house in Picardy to come to Paris. He picked up the quill again and continued his work. The next section concerned accidental forms, the properties that could change without destroying the substance itself. A man could be pale or dark, thin or fat, learned or ignorant, yet remain fundamentally a man. But what of death? Was death merely an accidental change, or did it represent a substantial transformation? The masters debated this endlessly, and Thomas was expected to know the various positions and be able to argue for any of them. The hours passed in the rhythm of study. Write, read, think. Check the candle, trim the wick, add charcoal to the brazier, stand and stretch to keep the blood flowing, return to the desk. The pile of completed pages grew slowly beside his notebook. Each page represented hours of lectures attended, of books borrowed and read, of arguments considered and refined. This was how knowledge accumulated, not in great leaps, but in patient increments, one idea building upon another. Thomas heard the bells of Saint Julien ring for matins, the deep tones carrying across the sleeping city. Midnight. The monks were rising for prayer while the city slept. He should sleep too, he knew. He had another lecture in the morning, and Master Giles expected his students to arrive alert and prepared. But he was close to finishing his analysis of this section, and he wanted to complete it while the ideas were fresh in his mind. He worked on, his hand moving steadily across the parchment. The candle burned lower, and he knew he would need to light a second before long. He had 3 more in his chest, saved for nights like this when the work demanded more than usual. The expense troubled him, as all expenses did. His family was not wealthy, and every coin spent on candles or parchment or book loans was a coin not spent on food or firewood. But his father had been clear when Thomas left for Paris. Education was an investment, a path to advancement that might benefit the whole family. Thomas must not waste the opportunity. So he sat in his cold room, studying by candlelight while others slept. He memorized arguments and constructed syllogisms. He learned to think in the rigorous manner of the schools, to distinguish carefully between what was certain and what was merely probable. He absorbed the wisdom of Aristotle and his commentators, the accumulated knowledge of centuries of Christian and Muslim and Jewish scholars who had wrestled with the same fundamental questions. What is the nature of reality? How can we know what we know? What is the relationship between reason and faith? These were not abstract puzzles to Thomas. They mattered profoundly because they concerned the deepest truths about God and creation. To understand natural philosophy was to understand the works of God. To think clearly about matter and form, about motion and time, was to think clearly about the structure of the universe that God had made. The masters taught that reason and revelation were compatible, that the truth discovered through philosophy could not contradict the truth revealed in Scripture. Thomas believed this deeply, though he had encountered questions that troubled him, problems that seemed to resist resolution. The candle guttered suddenly, the flame dipping low. Thomas realized he had neglected to trim the wick. He pinched away the excess, and the light steadied and brightened. He was nearly finished with this section. Just a few more paragraphs, a summary of the main arguments, and he could stop for the night. His eyes burned with fatigue, and his shoulders ached from hunching over the desk. But his mind was still clear, still engaged with the problems before him. He wrote the final sentences slowly, choosing each word with care. A good summary must capture the essence of the argument without oversimplifying. It must be complete but concise, accurate but elegant. These were the ideals of scholarly writing that his masters had impressed upon him. He read through what he had written one last time, then carefully blotted the wet ink with fine sand from the pot beside his ink bottle. The sand absorbed the excess ink, preventing smears. He tapped it back into the pot and blew gently across the page to remove any remaining grains. Thomas closed his notebook and sat back on his stool. The silence of the deep night settled around him. No bells, no voices, no footsteps in the street. Just the tiny sounds of the candle flame and the faint crackle of the brazier. He felt the profound satisfaction that came from good work completed, from ideas wrestled with and, if not entirely mastered, at least better understood than before. Tomorrow he would face Master Giles's questions, but tonight he had done what a scholar must do. He had read carefully, thought rigorously, and added his own small contribution to the great conversation that had been continuing for centuries. He stood and began to prepare for sleep. The candle had perhaps an hour of life remaining, but he would save it for tomorrow night. He extinguished it with a small brass snuffer, and darkness filled the room except for the dim glow from the brazier. He undressed quickly in the cold, folding his clothes and laying them on the chest at the foot of his bed. The wool blanket was cold when he slipped beneath it, but his own warmth would soon make it comfortable enough. As he lay in the darkness, Thomas thought about the life he had chosen. It was not an easy life, this existence of poverty and study, of cold rooms and borrowed books, of constant examinations and disputations. Many students left Paris after a year or two, defeated by the difficulty or the expense, or simply by homesickness. But Thomas could not imagine being anywhere else, doing anything else. Here, in this city of scholars, he was learning to think, to question, to seek truth with all the tools of reason and all the resources of tradition. Here, he was becoming what he had always wanted to be, a man of learning, a servant of wisdom. The last sound he heard before sleep took him was the bells of Notre Dame, ringing out the hour across the rooftops of Paris. The great cathedral stood on its island in the Seine, its towers reaching toward heaven, its stones and glass proclaiming the glory of God. Tomorrow, Thomas thought drowsily, he would attend Mass there before his lecture. He would pray for understanding, for the grace to see clearly and think rightly. And then he would return to his books, to his candle, to the patient work of scholarship that filled his days and gave meaning to his nights. If you are enjoying this content and would like to join our community of nighttime travelers, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications to support our channel. The scriptorium of St. Victor Abbey fell silent as the bell for none rang across the cloisters. Brother Edmund of Canterbury paused in his work, his quill hovering above the parchment as the last echoes of the bronze bell faded into the grey November afternoon of 1298. Around him, a dozen other scribes did the same, each man rising from his desk to offer the brief prayer that marked the 9th hour. Their voices joined in a low murmur of Latin, the familiar words of the office flowing automatically while their minds remained half occupied with the manuscripts before them. Edmund resumed his seat and examined the page he had been illuminating since dawn. The letter C that began the chapter was nearly complete, its curves filled with intricate vine scrollwork in red and blue, tiny leaves of gold catching what little light filtered through the narrow windows. He had been working on this psalter for 3 months now, and the abbot expected it finished before Advent. It was destined for the chapel of a Norman nobleman whose generous donation had funded the abbey's new infirmary. The work must be flawless. He reached for his burnishing stone, a smooth piece of agate that had belonged to the previous master illuminator, Brother Anselm, who had trained Edmund in this craft for 7 years before his death the previous winter. The stone was warm from being tucked in Edmund's sleeve, and he used it now to polish the gold leaf he had applied that morning. The motion was gentle, circular, pressing the metal into the gesso base until it gleamed like sunlight captured on the page. This was delicate work that required patience and a steady hand. Too much pressure would crack the gesso, too little would leave the gold dull and uneven. The scriptorium occupied the entire south side of the cloister, positioned to receive the best light throughout the day. Even so, on a day like this, with clouds heavy and low, the illumination was poor. Edmund worked close to the window, his desk positioned where Master Anselm had placed it years ago, in the spot that received the first morning sun and held it longest into the afternoon. The other scribes were arranged according to their seniority and the nature of their work. Those copying texts sat in the middle rows where the light was more even. Those doing fine illumination work claimed the window seats. Edmund set down the burnishing stone and selected a fine brush from the collection in the wooden box at the corner of his desk. The brushes were made from squirrel tail hairs, each one trimmed and shaped for specific purposes. This one, the smallest, was used for the most delicate details. He had made it himself last spring, learning the technique from Brother Anselm, who had insisted that a good illuminator must know his tools as intimately as a knight knows his sword. The paint he needed was vermilion, a brilliant red made from cinnabar that the abbey purchased from merchants who brought it all the way from Spain. It was expensive, nearly as costly as the gold, and Edmund used it sparingly. He mixed a small amount on his palette, adding just enough glare, the binding medium made from egg white, to give it the right consistency. Too thick, and it would sit on the surface of the parchment without penetrating. Too thin, and the colour would be weak, requiring multiple coats. He tested it on a scrap of parchment kept for this purpose, adjusting until it was perfect. The detail he was painting now was a tiny flower, no larger than his smallest fingernail, nestled among the vine scrolls that filled the body of the sea. The first stroke defined the central part of the bloom. He held his breath as he painted, keeping his hand absolutely still. The brush moved with the barest pressure, depositing the vermilion in a smooth, even line. When he had been an apprentice, his hands had trembled with nervousness, and Brother Anselm had made him practice for months on wax tablets before allowing him to touch actual parchment with paint. Around him, the scriptorium filled with the sounds of scholarship. Quills scratched steadily as the copyists worked through their texts. Someone coughed quietly, trying to suppress it. Brother Martin, the armarius who supervised the scriptorium, walked slowly between the desks, checking progress and offering quiet corrections. The elderly scribe near the door, Brother Hugh, hummed softly under his breath as he worked, a habit the armarius had long since given up trying to correct. The sound was oddly comforting, a sign that all was proceeding normally in this place, where words were preserved and multiplied. Edmund completed the flower and sat back to examine it. The colour was good, rich and vibrant against the cream of the parchment. He would add highlights later, tiny dots of white lead that would make the petals seem to catch the light. But that must wait until the vermilion was completely dry, which would take several hours. In the meantime, he could work on another section of the page. He turned his attention to the border decoration that would run down the left margin. This was to be a series of intertwined vines with leaves in green and gold, punctuated by small fantastical creatures, a rabbit, a bird, a dragon no larger than a mouse. The abbot had approved these playful elements, understanding that they would delight the nobleman's young sons, who would use the psalter for their devotions. Edmund sketched the design lightly in lead point first, the faint lines barely visible on the parchment. Brother Anselm had taught him to plan everything carefully before committing to paint, to see the whole design in his mind before beginning. The lead point moved smoothly across the parchment, leaving its silvery trail. Edmund had prepared this sheet himself, one of 40 that would make up the finished psalter. The parchment was calfskin, vellum of the finest quality, purchased from a parchment maker in Paris, who supplied the great cathedral schools. It had been soaped, scraped, stretched, and prepared according to methods that had not changed in centuries. The surface was smooth as silk under Edmund's hand, receptive to ink and paint, durable enough to last for generations if properly cared for. As he sketched, Edmund thought about the journey this book would take. From his desk to the abbot's inspection, then to the binder, who would sew the gatherings and attach them to wooden boards covered in leather. The nobleman would receive it with ceremony, probably at Christmas, and it would take its place in his private chapel. Perhaps, centuries from now, other hands would turn these pages, other eyes would see the work Edmund was doing today. The thought was both humbling and thrilling. This was why he had entered the monastery, not for the prayers alone, though those mattered deeply, but for this work of preserving and creating beauty in service to God. The afternoon wore on. The light shifted and faded as the sun, hidden behind clouds, made its way westward. Brother Martin lit the candles in the great iron candelabra that hung from the ceiling, though he was sparing with them. Candles were for winter evenings and the darkest days. On a November afternoon, even a grey one, the natural light was still sufficient for most work. Edmund continued without pause, his concentration absolute. The world had narrowed to the page before him, to the delicate placement of each line and curve. He mixed green paint now, combining yellow orpiment with blue azurite to create the exact shade he wanted for the leaves. The colours were ground from minerals and stones, each one requiring careful preparation. The orpiment was particularly dangerous, arsenic-based and toxic if ingested. Brother Anselm had warned him never to point a brush with his lips after dipping it in orpiment, a common habit among careless scribes that had sickened or killed more than one illuminator over the years. Edmund kept a small cup of water at his desk for cleaning brushes, changing it frequently to prevent contamination. The leaves took shape under his brush, each one a study in light and shadow. He used a darker green for the undersides, a lighter shade where the light would strike. Though the leaves were tiny, barely the size of a grain of wheat, he painted them with the same care he would give to a full-page illumination. Brother Anselm had been insistent on this point. Every element of a manuscript deserved the illuminator's full attention, because every element was an offering to God. To paint carelessly was a form of irreverence. The dragon came next, its serpentine body coiling among the vines. Edmund smiled slightly as he painted it. These marginal creatures were his favourite part of the work, the moments where he was allowed to exercise imagination within the bounds of tradition. He gave this dragon a whimsical expression, fierce but somehow comical, its tongue protruding slightly from its mouth. The nobleman's sons would laugh when they discovered it, and perhaps that small moment of joy would draw them closer to their prayers. Brother Martin stopped at Edmund's desk, leaning close to examine the work. He nodded slowly, his weathered face showing approval. The Almerius was a man of few words, but his presence was a constant in the scriptorium, a quiet authority that kept the work flowing smoothly. He pointed to a spot where Edmund had planned to place another flower, and shook his head slightly. "Too crowded," the gesture said. Edmund looked again and saw that Brother Martin was right. He adjusted his mental design, planning a simple leaf cluster instead. The bell for vespers rang, the sound rolling through the scriptorium and out across the abbey grounds. This time the work stopped entirely. The scribes capped their ink bottles, cleaned their brushes, and covered their manuscripts with protective cloths. Edmund performed these tasks with the automatic precision of long habit, ensuring that everything was secure before he left his desk. A spill or smudge could ruin weeks of work. The monks filed out in silence, making their way to the church for the evening office. Edmund fell into line between Brother Hugh and one of the younger scribes, a novice named Peter, who had only recently been allowed to begin copying simple texts. As they walked through the cloister, Edmund could hear the wind rising, rattling the last leaves on the fruit trees in the abbey orchard. Winter was coming, and with it the long dark months when the scriptorium would rely heavily on candlelight, when the scribes would work with cold, stiffened fingers, when progress would slow. But Edmund did not mind the winter. There was something peaceful about the scriptorium in the coldest months, the sense of being enclosed and protected while the world outside froze and slept. The work continued regardless of season. The steady accumulation of pages, the transformation of blank parchment into vessels of knowledge and beauty. Each book that left St. Victor carried with it the labour of months or years, the combined efforts of scribes and illuminators, rubricators and binders, all working in concert to create something that would outlast them all. After Vespers came supper in the refectory, a simple meal of bread, cheese and ale. The monks ate in silence while one of the brothers read from the lives of the saints. Edmund barely heard the words, his mind still occupied with the Psalter, planning the next day's work. He had perhaps 2 more weeks of illumination before the manuscript would be complete. Then there was another project waiting, a gospel book for the abbey's own use, to replace one that had become too worn for regular service. After that, a book of hours commissioned by a wealthy widow in the town. The work was never-ending, and Edmund was grateful for it. After supper came a brief period of recreation, and then Compline, the final office of the day. Edmund knelt in the choir with his brothers, his voice joining theirs in the ancient psalms. The church was dark except for a few candles on the altar, and the singing echoed in the stone vault above. These moments of prayer punctuated the day's work, giving it rhythm and meaning. The work of copying and illuminating was itself a form of prayer, Brother Anselm had always said, but it needed these formal offices to frame it, to remind the scribes why they laboured. Finally came the great silence, when no monk was permitted to speak until after Mass the following morning. Edmund made his way through the darkened cloister to the dormitory, a long room where the monks slept in individual cells. His cell was barely large enough for the narrow bed and a small chest that held his spare habit and few personal possessions. He undressed in the dark, folding his habit carefully, and lay down on the straw mattress. Sleep came slowly. Edmund's mind was still filled with colours and forms, with the image of the page as it would look when completed. He saw the gold catching the light, the vermilion flowers glowing against their blue background, the whimsical dragon keeping watch over the sacred words. He thought of the noblemen's sons learning their letters from this book, their young voices stumbling over the Latin psalms. He thought of all the books he had worked on over the years, now scattered across France and beyond, each one carrying a piece of his labour into the world. Outside, the wind continued to rise, and Edmund heard the first drops of rain against the dormitory roof. The sound was soothing, a reminder that he was safe and dry, enclosed in this community of prayer and learning. Tomorrow he would return to the scriptorium, to the patient work of the brush and the subtle blending of colours. There were pages yet to complete, beauty yet to create, words yet to preserve for future generations, who would turn these pages with reverent hands. The Psalter would be finished before Advent. Edmund was certain of that now. The nobleman would be pleased. The abbot would be satisfied. And somewhere in the future, readers yet unborn would see the work Edmund had done by the grey light of a November afternoon in the year of our Lord 1298. That continuity, that connection, across time through the medium of the written word, was what sustained him in this life of discipline and devotion. He was part of something larger than himself, a tradition of learning and artistry that stretched back centuries and would, God willing, continue for centuries more. With that thought, Edmund finally slipped into sleep, the rain drumming softly on the roof above, his hands still tingling slightly with the memory of the day's work, his dreams already beginning to fill with gold and vermilion, and the intricate dance of vines across creamy parchment.